Dearlove. Hi, Richard.
Hey, hi. Hi, Kate. How are you?
Great to see you. I'm good, thank you. Did you by any chance hear Donald Trump's comments earlier on today as he arrived at the summit?
Which ones?
That's a good question. It's difficult to know where to start, isn't it? Because, we're in the final stages of this NATO summit, but for Donald Trump, it's the most important moment. It's been condensed into a much shorter meeting. We already know what the communique is likely to say. The president arrived here this morning. People were hanging on his every word. Wanted to talk about that intelligence leak. He wanted to talk about the fact that his own administration, his government has had a leak which is pretty badly timed for him, which suggests that his bombing attack on Iran may not have been as successful as perhaps he'd said. What do you make of it?
I'm very sceptical about that report. Who leaked it? I know the American intelligence community pretty well.
Yeah.
And you don't get a leak like that from the CIA or the DIA or any of the other bits, which is, so instantaneous. So that strikes me not to take it entirely at face value. There's huge excitement generated. It's reminiscent a bit. Let's go back to Iraq. Do you remember
Yeah, I do.
some of the events around Iraq when there were leaks and conversations and the press jumped on every single one? And of course they jump on this one. But there's something about it which is strange. How on earth does an analyst sitting at Langley or in the DIA headquarters know actually what happened? You can't judge it from overhead. No one's visited the site. So I think it's a lot of excitement generated. It's embarrassing for the White House because it looks like it is genuine. But on the other hand, I don't think it amounts to very much at all. I think it's sort of, not being a journalist, I can say it's typical of the excitement that's generated around a journalistic event when you're not quite sure what its significance actually is.
Two things about that. The first is, if you're right and we take your view as a given, then nobody can know. And that means Donald Trump can't know that he has obliterated, and that's the language that he used, Iran's capability. And that's what this ceasefire is based on. A lot of the language that Donald Trump is using is very certain. So either we can't know on both counts, or we have to take one of them at face value. Pete Hegseth was in the briefing with Donald Trump earlier, the Secretary for Defense, and he said that the intelligence that he's seen is, quote, flawless. And he was talking about how he was aware of reports which had suggested the damage was moderate to severe. And he said he believes it's more on the severe side. And he said that this was politically motivated to make the president look bad. And Trump went on to call CNN scum. In fact, he called all the journalists involved in this story scum. It's a really good question, isn't it? How are we ever going to really understand? Because can anybody put people on the ground to go and check this stuff out?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know is the answer. Presumably at some point the Iranians themselves have to go in there. Once they do and there is factual material, maybe we can depend on Israeli intelligence to get wind of that. You're not going to be able to believe what the Iranians say. You might be able to believe what Israeli intelligence says. I think the other point to make in relation to the White House is that the armaments people who design these bombs know in detail what their performance might or should be. So I would rely on a sort of scientific judgment of the result of dropping this weapon. And maybe that's what the White House are depending on.
Yeah.
And medium to severe damage suggests to me that's probably a reliable estimate, but it is only an estimate. No one actually knows at the moment. But as I keep saying, these centrifuge cascades are extremely fragile and super sensitive. And it's like, smashing China during an earthquake. I think the results of the attack would have probably been pretty profound on the Cascades.
And what you're talking about there, to be clear, is that the Iranians have been enriching uranium, And that's the process which you use to do that.
It's a series of centrifuges. It goes down through these things and comes out at a much purer level when you get to the bottom. I mean, it starts off at the top at 5% and comes out. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but
Let's
I've
not
got a
give
rough
people full instructions
I've got a rough idea of how it
enrich
works.
uranium. But the point of this is that we are aware that Iran had enriched to 60%.
Yeah.
That's what people thought. And there's been a lot of speculation around whether Iran had managed to move that enriched uranium out of Fordo or anywhere else, actually, and whether that's now being stored. Interestingly, in his remarks this morning, Donald Trump suggested that he believed that it was still all in situ, and therefore the American attack had destroyed it or made it unavailable to the Iranians. But I think that will be a big point of contention when it comes to next steps in removing Iran's capability.
Yeah. Well, obviously, and I see from reading the press, they're now talking about another site under a quote-unquote pickaxe mountain, and that there may be another set, a much smaller centre with, secret centrifuges cached there, and that you could take the 60% and purify it. But look, I think these speculations will be endless until we have some factual material, which I think, will eventually emerge, whether it emerges from penetration of Iranian circles or, maybe we'll have a political crisis in Iran, and that'll tell us the answer. We just, at this moment. But look, whatever has happened, and I think I would say this with a fair degree of confidence, the program to create fissile material has been seriously set back. I mean, remember that they've killed a number of the scientists. They've attacked the main sites. They've disrupted the communications. I mean, there are so many things that have actually happened. You can't just say, oh, well, this isn't going to make much difference. It does make a big difference, I think.
Of course. And the fact that we're talking about this, of course, tells you that Donald Trump has, as he always does, bent the agenda of NATO to his direction of travel.
It's extraordinary what he's done. And, he comes here, you've got a pre-signed agreement pretty much for the majority of states to rise to 5% spending, which is in recent times unheard of. He comes here on a wave of probably having stopped or delayed massively the Iranian nuclear weapons program, which has been, let's say, a huge destabilizer in the Middle East. So one has to be surprised and to an extent admire the way that he's shaped important global events in the last months.
We know that those NATO leaders are locked in a meeting right now.
Yeah.
They are talking about the 5% defence spending pledge, 3% of real defence spending, 1.5% on infrastructure. The expectation is that the wording for the communiqué has been changed sufficiently to allow all of the member states to agree to it, including Spain, who don't want to sign up formally but may be persuaded to. And I suppose one of the things for me is the attitude of Mark Rutte, who is the Secretary General, towards Donald Trump. Overnight, he'd seen one of his own personal private messages to Donald Trump leaked in the press. He said, not a problem. Don't really mind about that. It's totally fine with me. It is a bit embarrassing. But today, the interactions between the two men, it's very, very clear that Rutte's sole aim here from this NATO summit is to flatter, is to make Donald Trump feel good about himself, is to make him feel like he is the centre of this meeting, that it's almost all been drawn together for him. I have to say, so much so that he actually called Donald Trump Daddy this morning. Unbelievably.
It reminds me of that Hollywood movie. I can't remember which one it is. When Big Daddy.
Big Daddy, yeah. If you'd have said Big Daddy, I feel like it would have been...
I think Big Daddy would have been much more appropriate.
Well, it would have been
because
much worse.
The character in the movie is Big Daddy, and there's always the references to Big Daddy. What movie is it? Remind me.
We'll look it up after the fact.
Anyway.
But he was talking because Donald Trump had likened Iran and Israel to children squabbling.
Squabbling, yeah.
And then Rutte had intervened and said, Daddy, how do you think this makes Rutte, NATO more generally look?
Well, I think it makes them look pragmatic. I mean, I don't think we should be too put off by the optics.
Would you call Donald Trump Daddy?
No, I wouldn't. I'd call him Mr. President. but maybe if I knew him well enough, I would sort of try-ike him. I mean, he has a sense of humour.
He does have a sense of humour, you're right.
And it may not be to everyone's taste, but I think Rutte's played a blinder, actually, because, I mean, so many NATO Secretary Generals have been so cautious. I think Rutte's done a very good job. I mean, he's really, he was an excellent Prime Minister, but he's also grown into the job, and he's played his cards very cleverly, and he's got pretty much a pre-agreement. I mean, who would have imagined a year ago that the NATO member countries would come together on such a controversial stage. I mean, controversial agenda, but the background is extraordinary too. And it looks as though, this will be marked down as a pretty successful summit, which has achieved something, plus, maintained a working relationship with a president who has a problematic or had a problematic attitude towards NATO. Maybe now we're moving into a different era. So, we've nailed down the 5%, right, 3.5 plus 1.5 on infrastructure. The question now is how the money's spent and what NATO actually does with it.
I mean, it is a victory, and I'm sure that Mark Rutte will leave this summit feeling like he has secured something that maybe didn't look likely. But has it come at the expense of Ukraine? I mean, the Ukrainians here, when you speak to them, they are maintaining a united front. They are very clear, NATO is behind us, we're here for a reason. But the reality is NATO has not been front and centre of this conference, and the reason for that is Donald Trump. It's uncomfortable.
Ukraine hasn't been front and centre.
Ukraine hasn't been.
Yeah. No, well, that's true, and it's highly problematic for Ukraine because Ukraine, has seen itself as at the centre of NATO's agenda, particularly if you remember the last summit and the whole question of Ukrainian membership, which has slipped sideways.
It sounds like that slipped back even further this time.
It's gone further back, I think, because it's clear the Americans or the Trump administration at the moment would never agree to it. I think there are divided views on that. But the good thing that's come out of it is the European member states of NATO have made very significant pledges towards supporting Ukraine. So they're all increasing their support and their budgets over time. And there's been nothing, I mean, I think the positive thing is that there's been nothing said about the reduction of American support for Ukraine. So I'm not even sure where we stand on that. Do you know where we stand on that? I don't.
Well, I think the previous administration's commitments remain. I think the question has always been about this administration's future commitments and whether there is a quid pro quo. And we heard a lot, of course, about minerals and rare earths and the agreements that have been struck. So I think there's a lot hinging on the transactional nature of this administration. I suppose the reason I asked the question is because there is a feeling in the British delegation and in other European delegations, particularly France and Germany and Poland, that NATO is still ignoring the biggest question that faces most European nations, which is Russia, and still not taking Putin seriously enough.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that, one of the problems with the US administration, we've already discussed this, is the fact that it's almost as though Ukraine is separated off as an issue to be dealt with on its own, and that I don't want to prejudice my relationship with Putin, so we can't be too nasty to him at the NATO summit. I think that the key to getting this right is that all these issues are interconnected and, not should be treated as one, but should be treated as clearly contingent, relying on each other as to what the solutions might be. And that would be my main criticism of Trump's approach at the moment. But I think that the evidence suggests that there's been a transition in his thinking over the last 6, 8, 10 weeks on Ukraine. And some of the things that were being said aren't being said. And I just wonder where we'll end up on this issue.
Yeah. Well, we know that the two men are meeting, President Zelensky and President Trump, or in theory later on today, although it has to be said the timetable for the meetings today has been put back by Donald Trump's quite lengthy remarks to the press. He was asked, the American president, what they would talk about. And he sort of joked. He said something like, Ukraine's got a little difficulty at the moment. We're probably going to talk about that. I imagine that'll be the biggest thing that comes up. Do we expect anything very much out of that meeting, or just the fact they're meeting is enough?
Well, they're meeting, and if they have a positive meeting, that's a plus. I think the problem at the moment is that Putin seems to be running out of military options, so he's targeting civilians. And I don't think that's anything that anybody can endorse or approve of. You've got these constant attacks on Kyiv and other major cities in Ukraine with significant civilian casualties and not much happening, or very little happening on the front line. So is Russia running out of options? What exactly? And I think that probably there's growing impatience in Washington, because there have been absolutely no concessions of any nature at all in Putin's original Ukrainian policy. And if you're going to have a compromise there has to be a compromise. I think that the very revealing comment that the Ukrainians made, and someone made it to me, we don't need Putin's help to surrender to the Russians, and they're not going to.
Yeah.
Sorry, we don't need Trump's help.
Trump's help.
Yeah.
We definitely don't need Putin's help.
No.
So we've covered the things that have been talked about. We are speaking in the middle of the final stages, and there are the press conferences to come. I suppose the big question is now, can everybody make it to the end of the day without a big fallout or a spanner in the works? If there is one coming, what do you think it would be? Maybe the NATO... What do you think of Trump's remarks overnight on the plane about Article 5? He was asked about whether Article 5 still stands, whether he could be relied upon to come to the aid of an ally, and he said something like, there are different definitions of Article 5. Yeah,
well, we won't, if that's the case, we won't find it out at the summit.
No, that's true.
We would find it out in the event after this event. So I think that you pretty much, maybe you might have a bad meeting between Zelensky and Trump. I think if there's something to go wrong, given that we know that the chemistry in that relationship doesn't always work, and that both parties have relatively short fuses. And remember, both are TV personalities.
Yes.
Not
they
one,
understand.
both of them. So they understand the nature of generating drama and engaging an audience, which is pretty unusual. Not many heads of state have had that capability. Well, Reagan did. So, I mean, that could go wrong. But I think my feeling about this summit is it's pretty prescripted. And everybody's reasonably relaxed and knows where it's... Because, look, if you've got a controversial meeting, we all learnt this, those of us who chair boards and chair meetings, we all know that you try to avoid to have your arguments and discussions. You spend hours beforehand preparing the ground so you don't have any surprises. Yeah. The feeling I've got about this NATO meeting is it's that type of meeting.
Interesting. Because with Donald Trump, you never quite know.
You never quite know. I agree, and I think with someone like Zelensky, you probably never quite know either, because he has such massive national equities which are in danger, and he's a sort of leader of last resort. So you've got these two powerful drivers. And, when they rub up against each other and then the relationship isn't good, it could go wrong.
It could go either way. Well, look, we will keep an eye on those press conferences throughout the rest of the day here at the NATO summit. And we'll bring you up to date with whatever happens on the One Decision podcast and, of course, on our live feed. So make sure you do watch out for those. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kate McCann.
And I'm Sir Richard Dearlove.
Great to be with you.